Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. In this video I will talk about the geopolitics of North America. It will be the 9th video of a series titled Geography and Power, in which I describe the strength and the weaknesses of the different civilizations alive today on the planet. When we talk about North America, we refer to a group of two countries, the United States and Canada, two English-speaking countries whose economies are closely intertwined and which in the past developed in an east-west direction, whereas Mexico, which belongs to Latin America, always developed in a south-north direction. North America, which is totally dominated by the United States, covers an area of 19.5 million square kilometers, making it the largest continental block in the entire world. That continent is also a major maritime power since it is surrounded by three vast oceans, namely the Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean. Along the Pacific and Atlantic coasts of North America, there are many low-lying plains and multiple bays where it has been easy and profitable to build ice-free deep-water ports like Anchorage in Alaska, Vancouver on the Canadian West Coast, Seattle, the ports of the San Francisco Bay, and the port of Los Angeles. In the Gulf of Mexico, there is also the port of New Orleans, located at the mouth of the Mississippi River, a calm river that drains the immense central plain of the United States. Finally, on the Atlantic coast, there are exceptional ports like Norfolk in Virginia, Baltimore and New York, as well as on the Canadian East Coast, Halifax, and especially Montreal, which is located at the end of the St. Lawrence River, an often frozen river that drains the entire Great Lakes region. The fact that North America is a maritime power that controls an enormous and rich hinterland explains why its main cities and its economy are oriented towards the oceans. It's important here to mention the important role played by the Panama Canal, which has united the two coasts of North America since the near abandonment of the Strait of Magellan in 1914. The first settlers of North America were the ancestors of the American Indians who came from northeastern Siberia about 15,000 years ago. That first migration followed a north-south direction that respected the natural geographical orientation of the continent. That north-south orientation was the result of the continental drift that caused the tectonic plates of the old and the new worlds to move away from one another. That process gave rise to the Appalachians, the Mississippi River, and the Rocky Mountains. The next stage of settlement was the result of an historical accident. It all started with the conquest of the Christian city of Byzantium by the Ottomans in 1453, which gave to the Muslims the total control of the commerce between Asia and Europe. Since they knew that Europeans were using the spices produced in Asia to give flavor to the somewhat spoiled foods they consumed, Muslim traders began imposing heavy taxes on the spices that were transiting through the Middle East. Portugal, which was a country located on the Atlantic coast, was the first European country to seek a route that would bypass the Arab Middle East by sailing south around Africa. On the suggestion of Christopher Columbus, Spain, which was also an Atlantic country, also tried to reach Asia, but this time by sailing west. This is how Columbus accidentally came upon America, an immense continent that he could hardly have missed by continually sailing westward. For Europe, Africa and the Americas were then mere obstacles on the road to Asia. While Italy and Portugal were enriching themselves through the spice trade, Spain undertook to exploit what would become Latin America, whose first inhabitants, much to everyone's surprise, began to die off in massive numbers. As I showed in the 8th video of this series, if the American Indians were often exploited and often killed by Europeans during the following centuries, it was first and foremost the deadly diseases that Europeans unknowingly carried with them that exterminated the natives. Since they had been isolated from the rest of the world for many millennia, about a dozen deadly diseases of Eurasian origin, such as smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, or malaria, ended up killing roughly 90% of the American Indians. The counter-example of sub-Saharan Africa, which had been depopulated for millennia by slavery, intertribal wars, and epidemics, illustrates the devastating effect epidemics had on the Americas. Africans, who had always been in contact with the disease of the Old World, had developed natural immunities, which allowed them to regain possession of their entire continent at the end of the colonial era. In the case of North America, the massive die-offs caused by the epidemics had a major ecological effect on a continent that was undergoing an environmental renewal when the first European settlers arrived on the Atlantic coast at the beginning of the 17th century, which was 115 years after Columbus. Because the indigenous population had become sparse, the forests of North America had grown back and wild species had multiplied freely. Worse still, the Old World, especially Europe, was then experiencing a demographic explosion due to the widespread adoption of numerous food plants developed by the American Indians, such as corn, potatoes, squash, tomatoes, cacao, etc. Everything was therefore in place for a poor and overpopulated continent like Europe to spill rapidly onto a continent that had become rich and nearly empty. The result was the east-west expansion of the European settlers that was perpendicular to the north-south orientation of the North American geography. Two Atlantic powers would dominate that colonization movement, England and France. Although the English established their first colony at Jamestown in Virginia, 1607, and the French established theirs at Quebec in 1608, the two systems of colonizations were completely different. The 13 English colonies that would be founded along the Atlantic coast were settlement colonies where England sent its population surpluses, while New France was mainly a commercial colony that was exchanging European goods for the furs brought by the natives. To expand that commerce, the French sought to control the continent's main transportation routes, the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, the Ohio and Mississippi rivers with all their tributaries, which allowed the French to drain most of the fur trade towards New France. Since the St. Lawrence River lay north of the Appalachians and the Adirondack, in the cold part of the continent, New France in 1663, which is 55 years after its founding, had attracted only 3,200 European settlers, whereas the English colonies already had more than 80,000 inhabitants. For a long time, this demographic imbalance was more than offset by the fact that the majority of the American tribes were French allies. However, this advantage eventually faded, partly because French traders unintentionally contaminated their allies with diseases of European origin. It's worth noticing that despite the fact that the French waged many wars against the natives, especially against the Iroquois, for the control of the fur trade, no genocide against the natives have been carried out in New France. Since a maritime power like England was aware of its demographic advantage in North America, it adopted a strategy of gradual encroachment that aimed at surrounding New France with territories ceded by a continental power like France during the negotiation following each new European conflict. Therefore, the inevitable occurred in 1763 when France ceded New France to England after the 7 Years' War, which immediately provoked a revolt among the indigenous people of the Great Lakes regions, who rightly feared that they would soon be invaded by settlers coming from New England. Satisfied with its total victory in North America and desiring peace, England, whose leaders obviously didn't understand the geopolitical realities of North America, made the mistake of promising to the natives that they would prohibit any European migration west of the Appalachians. Since the English colonists had fought against France precisely to conquer those territories, the American War of Independence broke out shortly afterward. That war would end with the victory of the insurgents in 1776, only 13 years after the cession of New France to England. That delay had been so short that French Canadians, who had fought for 150 years against the American colonists, preferred to remain under the control of England, which was far away, rather than joining a powerful hereditary enemy that was too close. For the Americans, that rejection was not important, since their goal was not to expand into the snowy territories of Canada, but rather to launch what would later be known as the conquest of the West. Beginning on the Atlantic coast, that conquest would progress in an east-west direction on a 1,800 kilometers wide front. Psychologically speaking, the settlers then turned their backs to Europe and its problems. To expand their territories, the Americans used different methods. Poorly armed, the natives, whose population was still collapsing, were quickly forced to live on reservations. Texas and the future southwestern part of the present-day USA were taken from Mexico. Very often in their history, the Americans bought territories belonging to European powers. That's what happened to Louisiana, which was sold by Napoleon in 1803, to Florida, which was sold to by Spain in 1819, and to Alaska, which was purchased from Russia in 1867. In 2026, the list of the territorial acquisition by the United States seems far from complete, since in 2019, President Trump offered to buy Greenland from Denmark. We're talking here about a strategic territory rich in natural resources that has an area of 2.1 million square kilometers and only 56,000 inhabitants. We can add to that list numerous strategic islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean, as well as the naval base of Diego Garcia, located in the center of the Indian Ocean. When speaking about the territorial expansion of USA, the most interesting case is probably Canada, which in the past was often forced to retreat before the irresistible advance of American settlers. This happened in 1783 when the two countries divided the Great Lakes. Since those lakes were major natural obstacles, their lower half was then conceded to USA as well as the entirety of Lake Michigan. It happened again when the two countries arbitrarily drew a straight line along the 49th parallel to create their common border in the prairies. They did the same thing for the border separating Yukon and Alaska. In history, it's rare that such arbitrary international borders survive for centuries. It was because the Americans didn't want to colonize the coldest part of the continent that Canada has been able to acquire all the territories located between the Great Lakes and the Pacific Ocean. In Canada, the conquest of the West didn't respond to a real and pressing need. It's so true that in the 21st century, the population of Canada is made of isolated clusters scattered along the American border on a narrow strip of land which is 5,000 kilometers long and only 160 kilometers wide. This is where 90% of the Canadian population live. Since Canadians are tropical animals, like all humans, they always migrated en masse to the United States. The opposite almost never happened. To give a well-documented case, at least 30% of French-speaking Quebecers, some say 50%, emigrated to USA between 1840 and 1930. That large-scale immigration explained why northern Canada always remained extremely underpopulated. Internally, Canada is an artificial and unstable agglomeration of regions which all have a name even when they don't have official borders. Newfoundland, for example, is a natural country, as well as the Maritime region, which regroups 3 provinces. The same is true for French-speaking Quebec, which is centered on the St. Lawrence lowlands, which are themselves located north of the Appalachians and the Adirondacks. It's interesting to remark that Quebec occupies both banks of the St. Lawrence River, while the neighboring province of Ontario occupies only the northern shore of the Great Lakes. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the Ontario population lives in the Ontario Peninsula, which was so named because it was surrounded by 3 of the Great Lakes. That peninsula is so isolated from the other provinces of Canada that it is located north of the 45th parallel, which marks the southern border of Quebec, and above all, far south of the 49th parallel, which marks the southern limit of the Canadian prairies. Something else, the Trans-Canada Highway, which was built to unite the different provinces of Canada, doesn't pass through the Ontario Peninsula. There is also the fact that the shortest route from Montreal to Vancouver passes through the United States. The Canadian prairies are not a natural country, since they are clearly a part of the vast agricultural prairies of the American Midwest. Finally, there is British Columbia, which is limited by the Rocky Mountains on its eastern side, but that should logically be regrouped with the northern part of the Washington state around the little sea called the Puget Sound. As for the three empty and almost unused territories of the Canadian far north, it is clear that the Canadian federal government never found what to do with them. Nowadays, the human tidal wave, known as the conquest of the West, is clearly over. In 2026, that historical movement even seems to be flowing back, since hundreds of thousands of Californians are now leaving the state. If the center of mass of the American population keeps moving west, it's because modern international immigrants come from Latin America and Asia. During the past decades, the North American economy gradually reoriented itself along a north-south axis that follows the general orientation of the continent's geography. If this happened, it's because it's always easier to make profits when an entrepreneur or a state follows the natural slope of a territory. This is so true that at the beginning of the 21st century, all Canadian provinces trade more with the United States than with other Canadian provinces. In every region, Canadians living along the American border simply sell to the United States the large part of the resources they extracted from the far north. The Canadian modern economy is so intertwined with that of the United States that the Canadian dollar closely follows the fluctuations of the US dollar relative to the other world currencies. Economists even say that when the United States catches a cold, Canada sneezes. One of the political consequences of the shift from the old east-west axis of settlement to the modern north-south economic axis is that Canada gives the impression that it will soon disintegrate. After Quebec, provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan are now dreaming of becoming independent. In other words, Canada increasingly appears to be a geopolitical anachronism, a living fossil whose most likely destiny will be to join the American Federation. In the case of the United States, the conquest of the West had worldwide consequences, since until 1917 the Americans were so preoccupied with developing their country that they stubbornly refused to intervene in European affairs. For instance, when the First World War ended, American soldiers were quickly repatriated to America, which immediately returned to its traditional isolationism. Finally, it was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that transformed USA into the world superpower it had been since the end of the 19th century. While the Japanese, the Germans, and the Russians saw the Second World War as a bloody enterprise in which all problems would be resolved through bravery, courage, and determination, the Americans saw it as a simple engineering problem. To win that war, the Americans constantly tried to gain strategic advantages while reducing to a minimum their death toll. Knowing that their national territory was protected by two immense oceans and could not be conquered or bombed, the Americans decided from the outset to gain as much time as possible to make sure that the other great powers would weaken one another. That strategy also gave them time to transform their civilian economy into a war economy. A simple comparison of the armament production of the main countries at war shows that the Allies' victory was inevitable as soon as the United States entered the war. By the end of the conflict, the United States had built 150 aircraft carriers, whereas Japan had produced only 25. Likewise, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft, which was far more than all the Axis powers combined. On the European theater, the Americans let the Nazis and the Bolsheviks slaughter each other while they themselves amassed a gigantic quantity of weapons in Great Britain. Once that was done, they attacked and conquered North Africa, then Italy, in order to prevent the Soviets from establishing a foothold on the Mediterranean shores after the war. It's only when they were certain that Germany would lose the war that they landed in Normandy to conquer both Western Europe and all its coasts. They even let the honor of capturing Berlin to the Russians, which cost them 360,000 additional dead and wounded soldiers. On the Pacific Front, the Americans let the Japanese weaken themselves by fighting in multiple regions against the Chinese and against the many nations they were brutalizing in Southeast Asia. Seeing that the Japanese had made the mistake of spending a lot of resources to build fortresses on many isolated islands, American admirals concentrated their own resources to take the control of the Pacific Ocean before letting the isolated Japanese garrisons to rot and starve on their heavily fortified islands. After that, they advanced toward Japan by conquering only the islands they needed to build long-range bomber airfields. That strategy allowed them to burn most of the Japanese major cities well before having their first atomic bomb. If, during the Second World War, the Americans had fought on three fronts, namely in Italy, in Normandy, and in the Pacific, and supplied the fourth one in Russia, it's remarkable that their losses were limited to only 418,000 dead, while the USSR lost 26 million, China 20 million, Germany 7 million, and Japan 3 million. As a matter of fact, the majority of the 70 million deaths of that conflict were unarmed civilians killed by the Nazis, the Bolsheviks, and the Japanese fascists. It's worth noting here that if the atomic bombs were launched on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was because the American leaders wanted to save the lives of millions of American soldiers. Since the material losses across Eurasia were incalculable at the end of the conflict, and since the United States then possessed half of the world's industrial capacity, they could not return to their previous isolation and were forced to invest heavily in the reconstruction and defense of Western Europe and Japan. This was judged essential since the Soviet Union was then the second largest superpower of the world and was occupying Eastern Europe. Worse, the communist ideology was spreading fast, especially in China. That threat seemed real since it has been calculated that between 1917 and 1991, when the USSR empire collapsed, communism had grown in the world at the astonishing speed of 58 square kilometers per hour. In reality, the USSR's destructions and human losses during the war had been so immense that the country could not afford to attack the United States, which had the most powerful military-industrial complex in history and the exclusivity of the atomic bomb. The Cold War, which actually began before the end of the Second World War, would pit a continental superpower like the USSR against a maritime superpower like the United States. It was essentially an ideological war, a kind of duel between an elephant and a whale who had no good reasons to go to war. Economically speaking, communism was so inefficient, unproductive, and deadly that it was in fact a true miracle for the Western world, since it delayed for several decades the development of many giant countries like China and even India. As a result, the West was able to enjoy the long party of overconsumption that lasted from 1945 to 1973, during which the raw materials coming from the Third World cost almost nothing. Those 3 decades of happiness were also the product of an exceptional hard-working generation. Born between 1910 and 1930, that generation had spent its youth in the economic Great Depression of the 1930s before going to war to defeat fascism. After that, they rebuilt Europe and Japan, repaid their war debts, and created for their many children the richest society that ever existed. They even walked on the moon. Then, something totally unexpected happened. Their beloved children started to degenerate. A lot of them became lazy, fat, and emotionally fragile. Many started to accumulate huge debts and even refused to have kids or to defend their homeland. Decadence is a phenomenon that has been well documented by historians. In the past, it appeared every time a generation who had never suffered inherited a fortune it didn't earn or merit. As I explain in my French-speaking geopolitical book, which is available on Amazon, decadence is a social reflex that allows a rich society to quickly eliminate its wealth in order to bring back the shortages which are essential for the psychological well-being of humans. The human body, after all, has been designed to fight in a dangerous world where resources were rare. Through millions of years of evolution, our ancestors have developed survival instinct which quickly degenerated when their descendants started living in a very comfortable society. When pleasure, which normally rewards the winner in the struggle for survival, becomes simple entertainment, it quickly loses its appeal and rapidly becomes boring. The same negative results have been observed among the well-fed and overprotected animals who have been locked in cages, in a zoo, for example. Since human beings have complex cultures, a second phenomenon appears when a generation starts destroying the wealth accumulated by their ancestors. They get rid of the guilt they feel by inverting the producers' values of their forefathers. They start saying that good is evil and evil is good. In the case of the baby boomers of the 1960s, who had known nothing else but ease and comfort, they forced their governments to give them all sorts of benefits, if necessary by increasing the public debts or by neglecting to repair the cities, the roads, the bridges, and all the other infrastructures essential to a growing economy. We all remember the slogans invented by the baby boomers to justify their action during the 1960s and the 1970s. Make love, not war, or sex and drugs and rock and roll, etc. When they started doing that, there was nothing their aging parents could do to stop the decline of the country they had built and defended. At the beginning of the 21st century, the inversion of the normal values became so extreme in the West that professors in colleges and universities teach to their students that the Western world never stopped doing evil things everywhere on the planet and throughout history, whereas the exact opposite is true. It's very easy to show that, despite its flaws and its present and past crime, the Western world has been a gift of the gods for the rest of mankind. In addition to having invented the moral values that underpin the modern world, democracy, human rights, the separation of powers, equality of everybody under the law, etc., Westerners have also fought against and destroyed criminal ideologies such as Nazism, fascism, and communism. Even better, between 1945 and 1949, the United States have been the only country in the world to have atomic bombs, and they didn't use it to conquer the rest of the world. If the enslavement of black people was organized by black Africans and lasted for millennia, it was the Westerners who violently put an end to it in Europe, in the three Americas, on the Atlantic Ocean, and even in Africa during the colonial era. If Westerners did that, it was not because of any rebellion by the enslaved, but because they decided among themselves that it was an immoral institution. If Westerners did indeed colonize the third world countries, they also equipped them with modern institutions and technologies, which all the colonized people retained after decolonization. Furthermore, in the decades following the Second World War, the Western powers left their colony almost without fighting. It's also the West that invented a host of extremely useful international institutions such as the UN, UNESCO, the International Court of Justice, or the Red Cross. The West is also the only civilization that gladly accepts millions of immigrants and refugees, in addition to funding countless development projects in poor countries. The West also invented the television, cinema, theater, and numerous musical instruments, not to mention the countless masterpieces that these inventions made possible. It also created nearly all the sports that are extremely popular all over the world. It also developed almost all the science, the technologies, and the modern communication devices, the vehicles, the clothing, and the medical techniques used all over the world, without forgetting the millions of different instruments that we invented and perfected. It's also the West that launched the Industrial Revolution, the electric revolution of the beginning of the 20th century, as well as the computers, the internet, the robotics, and the artificial intelligence, etc. Finally, this is the West that the rest of mankind keeps copying, never the other way around. Nowadays, the acceleration of history caused by the internet and the cell phones has made sure that the entire human race has access to the same information. As a result, mankind is becoming more and more homogeneous. Everywhere, human beings follow the Western example. They urbanize, industrialize, start piling debts, grow wealthier, and often become decadent and stop having enough kids to replace the population. That phenomenon is obvious in China, for example. In a world where young people will become increasingly rare and in high demand, the United States of the future will be favored in many ways. First, it's the country which has been created by immigrants. Second, those immigrants came from all over the world. First came the British, then the Germans, the Scandinavians, people from Southern and Eastern Europe, Jews, Latinos, and today Asians and Africans. As a result, Americans are not afraid of immigrants, and their melting pot never stopped working. Third, unlike what is happening in Europe, most modern immigrants in USA are Christian Latinos who only want to integrate into their new homelands. As a result, the USA will keep receiving immigrants in the future, contrary to the other parts of the world. If we take into account the current ideological polarization caused by the decadent woke movement in USA, the country could possibly go through another civil war which could provoke the partition of its territory. However, such an outcome is unlikely for two reasons. First, because modern wokists, like the Confederates in 1861, are fewer than their opponents, and second, because no foreign country is strong and close enough to intervene in North America. Anyway, no foreign power would try to do that because the country is defended by nuclear weapons. It's worth mentioning here that decadence is not an event, but a process that can be reversed if wealth disappears from a decadent country. We saw it at the end of the roaring 20s when the excesses of the 1920s disappeared after the economic crash of 1929. The same thing will therefore happen in the 21st century when the coming economic depression will have eliminated the present waste of resources and the woke ideology that goes with it. At the international level, the fact that North America is surrounded by three large oceans gives its leader an important strategic advantage. They can dedicate most of their resources to the control of the seas. Since the oceans are flat, cover 71% of the Earth's surface, and are sparsely populated, they can be used to reach all the coastal regions of the planet without building costly artificial structures. Moreover, since water can carry enormous loads, modern ships equipped with nuclear reactors can sail for decades without ever needing to refuel. Of course, surface ships are easy to spot by planes flying over the flat surface of the ocean. Today, however, this drawback is offset by using the third dimension, for example, by using nuclear submarines, which nowadays are almost undetectable, especially if they hide among the mountains lining the ocean floors. Furthermore, space is increasingly used by the Pentagon for its communications and for obtaining information about the movement of armies operating on the continents. The control of the seas by the American Navy is so advantageous that USA never had problems to build alliances with the small coastal countries of the world, especially when those countries feel threatened by major continental powers. The American domination is so important that its navy controls, directly or through allies, most of the choke points of the world: the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Panama and the Suez Canals, as well as strategic straits like Bering, Tsushima, Malacca, Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, Cape Town, Bosporus, and Gibraltar. America also leads the Western civilization, which dominates 3 out of 5 continents: Europe, the 3 Americas, and Oceania, on top of having solid footholds in Southern Africa and even Asia, with Israel. Moreover, America's cultural soft power is so important that, as explained in the 8th video of this series on Latin America, 4 countries of the Western Hemisphere got rid of their army to rely totally on the United States to defend their territory. Those 4 countries are Panama, Costa Rica, Iceland, and Greenland. Over the past decades, NATO countries have done something similar by reducing drastically their military spending. When comparing the American strategic advantages to the logistical problems of continental powers like Russia and China, the imbalance in favor of USA becomes even more striking. Continental powers must devote a much larger part of their military budget to build, maintain, and defend large networks of roads, bridges, tunnels, and railways in order to protect their borders. Worse, their armies use petroleum and must constantly move across mountains, lakes, marshes, deserts, and frozen regions. No wonder that continental powers like Russia or China struggle to compete with USA on the oceans of the world. They just don't have the money to do it. This being said, the United States no longer dominates the whole world as they did after the Second World War. These days, their share of the world economy has sharply decreased. As a consequence, the only reasonable foreign policy for Washington in the future will be to concentrate its energies to protect the three Americas plus Greenland and to intervene in Eurasia only when its vital interests will be at stake. In other words, USA should copy the 19th century British policy which aimed at maintaining equilibrium of power in Eurasia, for instance by assisting India in her fight against an expansionist China. By 2026, only two civilizations openly threatened America: the Muslim world and China. As we said in the 6th video of this series, if the Muslim world is presently aggressive, its declining birth rate, its internal divisions, and its many enemies make sure that in the future it will lose a large proportion of its young men in multiple conflicts. Furthermore, Islam will inevitably follow all the other religions of the past and lose a lot of its believers who, for the first time since Muhammad, have a direct access to the scientific truth due to the internet. There is also the fact that the decent people who live in the Muslim world, and they are many, are increasingly ashamed of the horrific massacres extremists commit in their name all over the world. Now China. First, let's say that China has never been a dangerous country during its 3,000 years history. Second, its communist leaders have already squandered their power, mainly because they never understood how capitalism works. During the last decades, the enormous profits produced by their large population have been wasted in the construction of 65 million apartments which remained empty. Precious resources have been used to build a network of 50,000 kilometers of high-speed trains nobody uses, of thousands of bridges, of countless highways, and of dozens of high-tech airports. Entire cities have also been built without ever attracting the hundreds of millions of people Chinese experts had predicted. The worst part is that all these expenses were made without taking into account the Chinese natural environments or the workers' rights. What is more worrying is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, which is completely corrupt, never stopped tampering with statistics on such vital data as the country's debt, its fertility rate, or the total number of Chinese citizens. How is it possible to manage a market economy with false statistics? Nobody knows. The present economical, political, and environmental situation in China is so desperate that many young people no longer believe in their future and do not marry or have children, which further worsen the country's declining population. If the American leaders are clever enough to buy time and to avoid the catastrophe of the 21st century, especially the coming nuclear wars, their country will easily dominate the coming centuries, and especially the next wave of colonization towards the Moon, Mars, and the asteroid belt located between Mars and Jupiter. It's in the United States that many companies are presently working to establish space colonies in the coming years. This is no longer a dream, and time is the most abundant resources we do have. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "There are so many dawns that have not yet broken." I thank you in advance for liking this video, for recommending it to your friends, to subscribe to my channel, and to make comments after the video. It's very important for the diffusion of my videos. Thank you, and see you next time.